He's always speaking at our conferences because he brings so much to the table for us. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Big Jim and let him go with it.
Hey. Well, let's see. Well, good morning, everybody. I hope everybody's thawed. Got a little colder last night than we were expecting. And today I'm going to talk about the Oklahoma Wildman Project. This is a deal that's been going on for a few years now. I've been working on. It's still ongoing. Get a little bit more into what it is in just a second. Darren kind of summed it up a little bit. This is me in my natural habitat, as I like to joke about. Even before I was getting into Bigfoot, I was doing stuff with for fishing game and stuff like that. So I would be out in places like this. Okay. As Darren said, I'm the Western Oklahoma State Director for the MABRC. I'm also a member of the Arkansas Primate Evidence Society, or APES. And I grew up in the cross timbers of central Oklahoma. And a lot of people don't really consider them woods, but they are some dense, gnarly woods, and they are the largest woodland habitat in the state. And again, I've had biological training. I've got degrees in biology and natural science, and I've worked with the Oklahoma Academy of Science and the Oklahoma Biological Survey in the past. Basically, when they want to know what all's in an area, they would give me marching orders, and I would go out there and start seeing what's there. Okay. And I am also a Bigfoot witness. I have seen them on several occasions. My family has had encounters. My dad, my brother. And the area that I come from kind of has a reputation of there being something there. We have our own little small town monster. And in that area, the Kreiner creature's got some real infamy attached to it. Okay, now that being said, I am a witness, but I like to talk about Bigfoot, and I'll talk to skeptics too. And I'll engage them on even footing. And these are always some of the questions or some of these statements I hear. You'll hear, well, there was no Bigfoot sightings prior to 1958 because Bigfoot was invented in 1958. Well, I've actually heard that one. Then you'll hear, there are no Bigfoot in native legends. That's just the researchers making what they want out of the native legends. They don't talk to the natives. Well, skeptics don't talk to the natives either. So then you'll hear, there's no physical evidence of them because they don't exist. There can't be any physical evidence. Well, that being said, being a witness, I know these things exist. So if they exist, they can't just have spontaneously appeared in a magic puff of smoke. There has to be a record of them. Through written history, through the indigenous tribes, through the settlers, it has to be there. And this kind of led up to the Oklahoma Wildman Project, where I started looking through different databases, historical databases, looking for these old sightings, looking for these old encounters. And not just in Oklahoma, but this is the area I'm talking about because A, I'm in Oklahoma and I want to represent the home team here. But the stories are there. The information is there. Most people just aren't aware of it. Okay, now in this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about the types of information sources where you can find this stuff. A little bit about the indigenous tribal stories, then the removal era tribal stories. There is a difference. The indigenous tribes are the tribes that were historically here originally. Because after the removal era in the 1830s, a lot more tribes got kicked into Oklahoma. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about the early American-European encounters in this state. Then a little bit about tribal customs and giant bones. This was something very interesting that I recently discovered. And then a few little interesting finds that I found while reading and doing this information that I figured you guys might enjoy. And a little bit of sampling of our sightings from Oklahoma from the early days. Information sources, historical texts and documents. This is stuff like not just books on history, recorded papers and stuff like that. Different paperwork that was turned into government agencies, things of that nature. Your narratives, this is stuff like personal diaries people would write, or they would send people out and interview some of these old timers. There's a great one called the Oklahoma Indian Pioneer Papers, where they would send people out to talk to these old timers about 1911, these guys that were 60, 70, 80 years old, to get their accounts of what it was like living here well before Oklahoma was a thing. Then you got historical newspaper archives. There's a lot of these online. And you can go in there and just do a simple search for wild man and see what you get. Then local lore. I've talked to people. And they'll say, oh yeah, I don't know about a Bigfoot, but my granny, when she was a little girl, saw this thing that was big and hairy and looked like a man, and she called it the whoopadanger. Grab an ox and take it off into the woods. Again, it's secondhand, but this is an account of a sighting or an encounter that happened historically. And you've also got tribal legends from the tribes that were here. And you can go into books on different tribes. There's great samples. That's one good thing about Oklahoma. We have dozens of recorded accounts of tribal history from various tribes here in the state. Knowing what to look for. Wild man accounts. Now, when I use the term wild man, I have to explain this to you. Wild man in these newspaper accounts was kind of a catch-all. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Then you've also got to read between the lines. Because a lot of times these newspaper articles would write something up and they call it a bear or something else, but then you read what it's doing. And I've got a few little examples I'm going to talk about briefly. Okay, 1980. That's supposed to say 1880, but I was about half asleep. There was a ranch hand near Guthrie, Oklahoma that was complaining about wampus cats. And he said that he hated having to go out at night because of the wampus cats. He said that there'd be 4 or 5 of them. They traveled in packs. They'd scream at night, and these wampus cats would come up around your camp at night and throw rocks at you. Now, how many of y'all have ever seen a cat throw a rock? It's quite clear the wampus cats this guy was talking about was not a mountain lion, was not a cat of any sort. And this is a headline from a newspaper from 1912 in Montana, and I picked this in there because I love the story. This guy was fishing, and he had a little .22 pistol with him, and all of a sudden this bear shows up. And the newspaper's writing it off as it's a normal bear encounter. And the bear screams at him. He pulls out his gun and shoots, hoping to scare the bear off. And the newspaper says the bear runs up on its hind legs and kicks this guy like a football into the river. So think of those Messing with Sasquatch commercials and you pretty much get the idea. But again, the newspaper is sitting there saying, and we'll have to be more careful since there's a bear in the area. But I'm sorry, bears cannot do that. There isn't a bear on the planet that can sit there and hunt somebody into a river. So yeah, you have to read this stuff and kind of use your head when you're going through this. Well, that doesn't sound right. Okay. Okay, now I said that you kind of have wild man as a catch-all. Now back in the 1800s and 1700s, people believed that when somebody went off into the woods, they would go feral like a wild pig and turn into a big hairy monster. And there were actually people in universities that stated this. So, you get a report of somebody seeing a hairy wild man, and you'll say, well, back 20 years ago, there was a tornado, and little Billy got lost in the woods. So that's got to be little Billy. He grew up big, hairy, and mad. Well, again, this was a common belief. But the term wild man in these old newspapers can also refer to homeless people living in town. And sadly, there's some accounts that were quite, well, apparently it was a common hobby in Texas to execute wild men that were living in town. So, yeah. And it wasn't thought of as, hey, you just committed a very bad act. It was celebrated. Rather disturbing times in American history. It can also refer to hobos and people that live out in the woods like your mountain men. It can refer to people that just have a little bit too much and had a really wild time. Also has been used to refer to outlaws. This was Indian territory. There were outlaws. Cross-dressers, that was a fun one. You'll hear accounts like, we saw the wild man of blah, blah, blah. He's wearing a woman's dress. His name is Bob, blah, blah, blah. He lives at... Well, again, these were all lumped in as wild men, like they were the same thing. Then you'll hear stuff like Bigfoot. You know, we saw the wild man of so-and-so creek. He's a giant of a man, and he's covered head to toe in black hair. So, you got to kind of really read what they're saying. And this was kind of the idea of what they thought people that got lost in the woods turned into. I think I've seen a few of these guys running around.
At Walmart.
But yeah, this was the idea, that people would turn into something like that if they got lost in the woods. But you get stories. The wild man attack. This one was from Chaska, Oklahoma. And some guys were riding, and supposedly a 7-foot wild man covered in hair came out of the woods and grabbed one of the riders, picked him up off the back of the horse, and body slammed him. And the other guy fired a gun and it took off running. And this is the artist's depiction of what happened. Now, they're not depicting it as a Bigfoot, but a big, hairy, dark, naked guy with a beard. But when you read the account, if it happened today, it would be a Bigfoot encounter. This is another one. You'll see, the wild man took off on all fours. He was running as fast as a deer and jumped over a fence. Well, we know Bigfoot can walk on all fours. We've got members that have seen them. So that while the art in the paper is quite clearly depicting just a crazy hobo, what probably happened here was a Bigfoot sighting. Another one was that people have talked about abductions. This is one from Texas, the Marble Falls Monster, which I actually suspect that the county they said this happened, they got the location wrong because Marble Falls is one county down. But because of that, people said, well, they had to have made all this up because Marble Falls is not in this county. But the story goes, a teenage girl was out minding their farm and she was suddenly grabbed and picked up by an 8-foot tall, hair-covered wild man, and it took off with her, and they recovered her 3 days later in the Texas Hill Country. She was fine, scared out of her mind, but she was fine. Now, the native perspective. This is where I'm talking about our indigenous tribes, the guys that were here originally. And this is actually a picture of a typical Wichita Indian village. This is kind of what you would have saw in Oklahoma had you been here 200 years ago. Okay, now again, I mentioned earlier the indigenous tribes. That refers to the ones that were here and the ones that showed up before the Indian Removal Act of 1830. So these are the original tribes of Oklahoma. The Apache, the Caddo, the Comanche, the Kiowa, the Osage, and the Wichita. There was another one in there called the Tavoyas. They're no longer around at all. They were completely eradicated in the 1700s. Now, if these tribes were not aware of Bigfoot, why do they have words for them? The Apache, they call them the Kinsa. The Caddo, Kadaha. I'm not even going to try to pronounce the Cheyenne word for it because I know I would butcher it. The Comanche call them Maputs. The Kiowa call them Copsapole. The Osage, I just put question marks because the Osage language has been lost. One of the most powerful tribes in Oklahoma no longer has its language, so we don't know what the word was for them in Osage. And in the Wichita, it was Wichkatatska. So again, if they don't know what these creatures are, why do they have names for them? And this is a Caddo Kadaha mask. This was dug up. It is over 1,000 years old. Now, it's believed by most people to represent the Kadaha, the Caddo Bigfoot. However, you might notice it's got antlers. This was a common theme amongst the Plains tribes. When they would depict these things, they would put antlers or horns on them. It's been suggested that by some people that these things made headdresses. I don't know about that. It's also been suggested the tribes just kind of added it in there to show that these things are wild. Not human. And it's also been suggested that the Indians might actually see these things toting a deer off, and it's got a deer slung over its shoulder, and you see it from behind. You might see the antlers sticking up and think it has antlers. Now, these are just some of the traditional legends from the tribes in Oklahoma. The Osage had a legend about what they called the Battle of Monsters, where basically the Osage trapped a bunch of these things in a box canyon somewhere up in the Osage Hills country and killed every last one of them because they've been harassing the village. The Cheyenne have a story of what they call the followers. And what this translates into is the Cheyenne, as they moved into Oklahoma, originally from other places, they were hunting buffalo. And they said that they had a group of these things that followed them. And they were feeding on the leftover buffalo. And to this day, the Cheyenne Arapaho tribe is very protective of them. They consider them kind of part of their tribe or their pets. I don't know exactly how you would quantify that. The Pawnee have the stories of the giants and the flood. Now, the Pawnee aren't really an Oklahoma native tribe, but they are very close, and I have very little doubt that on some of their hunting expeditions that they ended up in Oklahoma. But they have a story about the great hairy man that was supposed to be so big that he could run down and kill a deer with the swing of his fist. And that one day there was a big flood and many of these things died. And they said that after these things died, other Indians showed up and took their place in that area. The Kiowa, they talk about down in the Wichita Mountains down by Lawton, they talk about Copsapole, how he guards that area. And that that name actually roughly translates to mountain giant or mountain ogre. And the Caddo, over on the Washita River, they talk about the hairy man. And the Caddo tend to believe that the hairy man is kind of a guardian of tradition. If the young Caddo men act up and don't follow tradition, they think the hairy man's going to show up and scare the living crap out of them and get them to obey. Now, these are morality tales, but the fact that they've woven this creature into myth doesn't mean it doesn't exist. This means it's kind of like Aesop's fables. They are using real organisms, real animals that they know and understand to tell stories. Now, new tribes, new tales. During the removal era, things were not pretty. 1830s, the Removal Act was signed, displaced thousands of natives from their homes in the eastern U.S., and they were forcibly relocated to Oklahoma. I'm not going to go into real depth on how bad this actually was, but I'm going to say this, it was pretty much genocide. Now, as the tribes began to come into Oklahoma, they already had their old legends. I'm not talking about the ones from where they came from. I'm talking about the stories about what happened after they got here. And as soon as they got here, encounters began to occur. Now, you got to think about it. You got Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw coming into Oklahoma. They're scratching out a living in cabins like this one. And that cabin's supposed to be somewhere in this county. I'm not exactly sure where, but it's in this county, so that's why I put it there. Now, I'm going to start with the Choctaw just because that's my own people, and I kind of know those stories a little better than some of the other ones. Now, the 1830s, there were claims that a group of hairy giants, the Haptapusachito, followed the Choctaw into Oklahoma. And the story goes that a powerful shaman named Ahoyatubi had smuggled a baby and took it on the Trail of Tears in Oklahoma. And he raised this thing. And the story goes that this thing, when somebody kind of pissed him off, he would send it to go harass him and harass them and just basically mess with them. Well, eventually, the tribe down there got mad, and the family that was supposedly the victim of all this harassing came in there and tied him to his bed and burnt his house down with him in it. But that was one of the stories from the 1830s. 1836, there's two versions of this one that I've heard, and this is supposed to have taken place in Pushmataha County. I've heard it said it was Oklahonally. It would actually be a distant relation to me on my dad's side of the family. And I've also heard it was one of the LaFleurs, which was a family of French Choctaw descent that were living down there. But supposedly the guy goes out to his corn crib and sees this big thing out there and punches it. Well, it punches him back, and then he punches it back. And then it finally turns around and runs away. And I've heard it said that it was near Antlers, and I've heard it said that it was off of Wild Horse Creek, just about 6 miles west of Honobie. And then in the 1860s, there was a boy down in the Tallahassee Mountains area that got lost, and they found him about a week later. And the boy said that he was being taken care of by the thing. And it was supposed to be this big hairy thing that was watching over this kid. Then in the late 1800s, there was an encounter near the town of Goodwater, which, if I remember right, there was supposed to be an elderly woman that wound up essentially putting a bunch of rock salt in the butt of one of these things and kept sniffing around the property. And The last of the Choctaw stories I'm aware of is Brown Springs. Supposedly there was a gang down there that was robbing people coming in and out of Texas. And one of the gang members did something very bad to a young woman. And the local Choctaw caught the guy, tied him to a tree, and let the Bigfoot get him. Now, if that one account that I mentioned of LaFleur family was true, then this would have been the cabin where that occurred at. Because I am familiar with that area. That's actually me sitting in the doorway of this cabin. I just thought I'd throw that in there. These aren't stories with no completely unknown places. Some of these places where they were supposed to have occurred at actually do exist. Now, I know some Cherokee stories from this area, too. The earliest one I know of is actually the 1835. The Bureau of Indian Affairs received an official document of grievances from the Cherokee Nation about just complaints about living conditions, things they were having to put up with, things they felt they were owed. One of the common complaints was skillas in the woods. Now, for all of the Cherokee in here, what's a skilly? Right. I have no doubt that skilla and skilly are the same thing. And in the 1830s, there were starting to get stories about giants living in some of the hollows from some of the Cherokee. Specifically, Mulberry Hollow, Beaver Gap, and Pumpkin Hollow were kind of the epicenter, but those are the ones that keep popping up. Then in the 1840s, there was actually a writer who was coming out of, I want to say Sallisaw, but I might be wrong on that. But it wasn't too far from here. And he was on horseback, and this gentleman carried a cavalry sword with him. And he said he seen this thing that he thought was a dog. But, he's like a big black dog. And he rides up to it and it stands up. And I guess, according to this account, which is in the Oklahoma Indian Pioneer papers, it grabbed the horse by the mane. Well, this guy freaked out. The horse is freaking out. He pulls out the cavalry sword and stabs it. And it hits the ground and rolls screaming. And again, this is like I said, this is in the Oklahoma Indian Pioneer papers. You can actually go to OU's website and look it up. The 1866, there were stories about the Poteau River wild man circulating with the local Cherokee. And the story goes that it was supposed to be a white man that got lost, got big and hairy, and the only thing he had was a hat. Because they said they'd see him wearing an old straw hat, and that was it. Which sounds weird, but there were reports in the 70s of a Bigfoot wearing a pair of blue jeans that were way too small for it and rotten, so weird crap happens. The 1870s, just to the north of here, there were stories of what was called the Keeper. And the deal was, there used to be a fellow by the name of Zeke Proctor that lived in this area. And there were stories that he had gold stashed in the mountains not too far from here, and that the Keeper was this huge hairy animal man that guarded the gold. They said if you had to find the gold, you had to follow the Keeper. I don't really think that would have led you to gold, but now this is a mask from the 1850s from this area. This is a Cherokee tribal mask. And I'm one of the people that kind of suspect this may actually represent a Bigfoot. Because if you look at it, looks like it's got hair coming right down here, deep set eyes, and the whole face kind of eerily, to me, resembles Bigfoot. More than it does, an Indian. And again, this is just my opinion. So, I only know 2 stories from the Creek Nation. One was the hunter and the Ihosa from the 1830s. And the story goes that this guy was out hunting. Where was it at? I want to say near modern day Eufaula, but I'm not sure. But the guy was out hunting and he noticed that there was a storm coming in, and it looked like it was going to be a bad one. So he goes down in this bottom and he finds a big cottonwood tree it's dead, but it's hollowed out. And he said, well, this is the only shelter I got. I'm going to get in here and get away from the storm. Well, he gets in the storm. And it's coming down. It's a downpour. And he notices there's something that walking towards the tree in the storm. And he whatever this is, it's big. So the guy kind of crams back in the corner of this little crevice in the tree because he don't know what this is. And he says that this huge, hairy Ihosa leans down, gets into the tree. It's so big that it can barely cram in there. And of course, this guy's holding his breath. The account talks about him complaining about the odor. He's back in the corner trying desperately not to touch this thing. He says it gets in, and as it's crouching in, it stops and looks down and sees his feet. And he says this thing's looking down like this and just goes. And he says it screams, runs back out into the storm. Kind of a funny story, but it's not entirely unbelievable. The other one that I'm aware of was from the 1850s. They called it the Tall Man of the Canadian River, and this occurred near the town of Hannon. And there were multiple sightings of what they called the Tall Man. And they said that the Tall Man liked to beat on trees. That's how you knew he was in the area, because you would hear the sound of a tree limb hitting another tree. You'd hear. And they said you could listen to that and tell where he was going. And there was supposed to be a old ferry down there, and they said that it liked to come down and hang out near the ferry and watch. These are some Chickasaw stories that I'm aware of. In the 1850s, there was the story of a stone corral down in the Arbuckle Mountains. And this is actually located in the Chickasaw National Recreation Area. I've been to where this was at. And the story goes that something kept getting livestock in this area, kind of formed a natural corral. So some of the tribes started moving their animals there. And the local, one of the local medicine men decided, well, we're going to keep it out. So he carved some petroglyphs into that area, and they're still there. But the idea was if he carved the picture of the Bigfoot on the rock, the Bigfoot would leave the animals alone. I don't think that actually happened, but even if there's not a story, there still are petroglyphs there. In the 1860s, in Turner Falls, there was supposed to be an attack of what was called a lofa. And the story goes, this Chickasaw man he had went to town, he was coming back with some supplies, comes into his cabin, and finds the door's been busted in, and his family's all dead. And they hadn't been shot, they hadn't been stabbed, they'd been torn. And the local Chickasaw in that area all said it was a lofa attack. And that's their word for Bigfoot. And then about the same time in my home turf, there's what we call the Hell Beast, which I love the name of. But the Hell Beast, the story goes, so there was a Choctaw man in the area, and he came in one day and he found his family had been brutally murdered by a group of outlaws that rode through there. Well, the story goes he rode off and got his revenge, but they said that his heart was so cold and filled with pain afterwards. He was so changed by it that on the first falling snow, that he turned into a monster to match what he had become inside. And again, this is just folklore, but the guy this supposedly happened to did exist. His name was Albert Lester. And Albert Lester, what he actually did is he was so heartbroken after he did get his revenge, he could not stay down there anymore, so he moved out without telling anybody. But it shows you that they were trying to explain sightings of something in the area. Here's a couple other tribal stories from some of the tribes that moved in. And the Niue from the Ozark Plateau is actually from the Delaware tribe. And the story goes that there were some men hunting and they shot and killed a little Bigfoot. And Daddy did not like it. And I can pretty much tell you what happened from there. The story says that they found the hunter wrapped around a tree. Then from the 1920s, there was a Seminole chief that told the story of him seeing a sea capi. Yeah, my words are failing me due to exhaustion, so you have to forgive me. But this is actually documented in a book called Oklahoma Seminole Tales and Folklore. And this was supposed to have been near Wewoka, if I'm not mistaken. And it's just a typical sighting. He was out there as a young man and said he seen a big hairy thing stand up and walk off into the woods. And in the 1830s, there were some stories of some of the Shawnee, near Shawnee, about a Singwa living in the woods. And there was supposed to be a house north of Shawnee, and they said the Singwa had ran the people that lived there out, scared them to the point that they left, and the Singwa had marked that house as its own territory. And this is a Pawnee painting from it's actually from 2011, but the guy's been doing paintings since 1980. This is what Ishchike the spider looks like in the Pawnee mythology. Ishchike the spider is a monkey or an ape. I thought this was kind of interesting. Okay, these are early encounters, mainly from Europeans and Americans. Okay, first Europeans to come into Oklahoma, Vasquez de Coronado, conquistador, from 1540 to 1542. He led an expedition that went through Mexico, New Mexico, West Texas, up into the Oklahoma Panhandle, and on up into Kansas. Now, when he was there, he got stories from the Apache, and this is actually in his accounts, of a hairy beast that lived in the Black Mesa area. This creature had man-like arms and legs, could walk on all fours, and said it had blazing eyes, large, broad, man-like feet. Had a head 3 spans wide, which meant hands. So 3 hands wide. The only thing that really didn't fit up with Bigfoot is they said it had small horns. But then I mentioned the Kadaha from the Osage, and it might be a similar thing, them adding that feature. But this was from the Black Mesa area, way out in far west Oklahoma. And after the Spaniards, the next major waves of Europeans were the French and the Spaniards, well, Mexicans coming in this case, but mainly fur trappers and hunters. You have the Coureur de Bois and the Voyagers, and they complained about there being atacapas in Oklahoma. The Ciboleros, the Spanish trappers, talked about lobazones, and the long knives, which refers to American trappers that didn't go into the Rockies, they trapped the lower lands of the U.S. interior, complained about hide-behinds. Now, the Ciboleros and the Comancheros were the earliest of the trappers and hunters to come in. They They mainly targeted big game, but they weren't above a little beaver trapping. And there is a difference. The ciboleros were actual hunters and trappers. The comancheros were supposed to be traders, but they also operated as mercenaries and human traffickers. But they were active from 1689 to 1870 in the Oklahoma region, primarily western Oklahoma. And the ciboleros had stories about lobazones in the Sierra Llamanos Mountains. Today we call those the Wichita Mountains down in Lott. And the lobazones were supposed to be something like a werewolf, a big, hairy, man-like creature that they believed was the cursed seventh son of a seventh son that would turn into a monster and run wild. And some comancheros in 1868 were at the Red River Crossing down by Denton, and they talked about the white thing at the river. These guys were crossing the river and they see this hairy white thing stand up and walk off. Keep in mind, I just said white. I'm going to talk about this later. This is one of those neat things I found. And then after the ciboleros, well, while the ciboleros were here, the French started coming in. The first were the Courrier de Bois, the wood runners. And these guys were beaver trappers. And eventually, France decided to kind of keep them under control and replaced them with licensed hunters called voyageurs. And the French didn't leave a lot of recorded documentation here, but we know they were here. Some of the areas still have French names. Like, if you ever look at the Ouachita Mountains in southeast Oklahoma, that's the French spelling of Ouachita. And the word Kayamichi, despite people insisting it's an Indian word, it's not, it's French. It means stork. So the French had stories about what they called the Atakapas, the mountain cannibals. And these are supposed to be big, hairy things that lived in there. And what we think they actually did is they got that from the Choctaw, because that sounds suspiciously like some of the Choctaw words for Bigfoot. Because the Atakapa sounds an awful lot like Hatak, and you'll hear stuff like Hatak Lusachito or Na Lusachito or Hatak Ofi. These are words generally used to describe Bigfoot, the Choctaw. The Long Knives are what they called the American trappers that stuck around in Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, didn't go into the Rockies. And they were active from the 1820s to the 1840s. And at the rendezvous, there is documentation of them being at the rendezvous in Boggy Depot in the 1830s and talking about seeing wild men. And another common one was the hide behind. These guys said, well, they'd see hide behinds in the woods. You'd see these big, hairy things peeking out from around trees and rocks and looking at you. And when you go to camp at night, they'd sneak into your camp and steal your food. Well, if that were today, that would be a classic Bigfoot encounter. And then we had the loggers move into the area. Logging really had actually been in the 1850s, but it began commercially in Oklahoma in 1910. And this picture is actually from about 35 miles south of here. Those are some big, thick trees. Those little things that look like G.I. Joe figures at the base of those trees are people. So those trees were well over 100 foot. And the loggers talked about what they called the hoo-hoos. They called it that because of the noise it made. And they said, well, yeah, the hoo-hoos, but at night you'll hear them go, woo, woo. In fact, there's actually a national logging society called the hoo-hoos because of this. The other ones, they would talk about hairy men and bear men being seen. And in addition to that, the military started showing up early in Oklahoma's history too. The Dragoon expeditions. led by General Henry Leavenworth. These were some of the first soldiers to explore Oklahoma, 1834 to 1835. And in their diaries, they record encounters with prairie grizzlies. But again, this is one of those things you actually have to look at what they're writing. They said that the prairie grizzlies would operate in groups, 4 or 5, and they would make nests in the sumac and the plum thickets. And they said they would flush deer towards the nest where the big prairie grizzlies would be inside. And they were going solely on footprints. They never actually laid eyes on it. But that doesn't sound like bear behavior to me. And they said that the prairie grizzlies, they'd often find tracks 17, 18 inches long. That is a little large for a bear. Fort Arbuckle was established in 1850. The idea was it was to stop raids from some of the tribes in the area. This was near Davis. There is an account from a soldier at Fort Arbuckle. He's talking about how there were 2 types of Indians that lived in the area. He said, you've got the kind that wear clothes, talk, and you can trade with them. Then you got the other kind that are hairy and naked and don't wear clothes and come out at night. And you can't talk to them because they see you, they run away. Fort Washita, 1842. Again, this was kind of to deter hostile tribes from attacking and raiding. And this was near Durant. To this day, it's supposed to be haunted. But when you read some of these accounts of the haunting from the 1800s, some people see white ghosts in the woods, some people see black ghosts in the woods, but commonly these ghosts tend to scream and throw rocks. So I don't think those are ghosts. Now, I've been talking about kind of a tribal connection with Bigfoot here in Oklahoma. But it's also led me to find some very interesting information out. Bigfoot is big medicine. This doesn't mean that Bigfoot has magic powers. This means that the tribes would often associate this creature with power. Kind of like we would an eagle or some kind of thing. It was special. Not supernatural, but it was special. A lot of the Plains tribes were terrified of the creatures, and some of those stories reflect that, because they believed it had power. Now, it's a big, strong animal. Yeah, I could see how they think it had power. So that being said, the remains of these creatures had to have the power. It turns out a lot of tribes actively were looking for the remains of these things. And a lot of times, when they found them, they would grind the bones up and make medicine out of it. Buffalo Bill Cody, 1871, he was visiting the Pawnee on their reservation in northern Oklahoma. And they show him, this particular group of Pawnee showed him their most sacred artifact. It was a femur, a leg bone, that was 3 feet long. They said it was from a giant. He assumed it was from a giant human. But they showed it to their doctor. He was with some military men that were there, and the doctor confirmed it was definitely human, or at least human-like. And Cache Creek, the early part of the 20th century, the Comanche supposedly found a skeleton of one, and they declared it a sacred site. Now, over the years, they said they eventually took all the skeleton and were grinding it up to use for medicine. Because, a lot of tribes, there's not a lot of money in that time frame. This would have been the early part of the 20th century, Depression. You can't afford medicine. Make your own. Now, there's a belief amongst the academic community that they were just raiding fossil sites. I've talked to the Comanche about this, and this is in multiple texts, that they were raiding fossil sites. And they said, no, we weren't raiding fossil sites. We took them to the fossils. We weren't letting them near that skeleton. the sea kept these trees, and this is a Seminole thing. Apparently, the Seminole tribe had a tradition where if they would find a tree that they thought had been altered by Bigfoot by markers or breaking branches or something, then they would view the spot as sacred. And they would use them whenever they would have babies die or children that were stillborn, and they would bury them at the base of these trees because they believed that the tall man would watch over the souls of the babies. So, that being said, if the tribes were actively looking for these things, they couldn't have got all the bones. There had to be some. Okay. But how effective could the Indians really have been in cleaning up the bones? Well, I'm going to show you something that's going to put this into perspective. Okay? We all know what this is. This is a buffalo. Why am I showing you a buffalo? Because there used to be millions of buffalo in North America. Keyword used to be. So, there's not anymore. The 1870s, they went out and sought to eradicate the buffalo and remove the food supply for the American Indians. This was an attempt to get most of the Indians to starve to death. And they systematically wiped out almost all of the buffalo. Now, those are piles and piles and piles of buffalo hides. There used to be millions of them. Now, they're leaving these things out to rot in the prairie. So, what happened to the bones? How often do people find buffalo bones out in the prairie anymore? Well, some of them got cleaned up by natural sources, but turns out they figured out how to make fertilizer out of the bones. So a couple hundred individuals said, hey, we can make money doing this. And they went out, and within 10 years, they had cleaned almost all of the buffalo bones up out of the prairie. Now, if a couple of hundred guys can clear out millions and millions of buffalo bones out of the prairie in 10 years, if Native Americans were actively looking for the remains of Bigfoot, which there would never have been as many Bigfoots as there were buffalo. How long? And they had hundreds of years to do this. How long do you think it would have taken them to get most of them? And this just kind of sums up what I just said. 10 years, buffalo were cleaned out. Bigfoot was rare even then. Suddenly it puts all this into perspective. But maybe a few did slip through the cracks. This was dug up near Fayetteville. This is the Fayetteville gorilla skull.
Arkansas?
Yes.
Yeah, they do a lot of stuff in Arkansas.
Maybe they got sharp knives though in Arkansas.
Yeah, Arkansas. Go on over.
But the Fayetteville gorilla, the doctor thought it was a gorilla skull. That's not a gorilla skull, obviously. Supposedly it's still somewhere in Fayetteville. The doctor that had it kind of just kept it as a curio, and nobody really knows where it went after that. Over the years, several questionable skeletons have turned up. And I know you hear people talk about giant skeletons, government conspiracies. I'm not getting into all that. I'm just simply saying abnormal bones have popped up in Oklahoma over the years. And a lot of times, since everybody knows that Indians and humans were the first creatures in North America like us, then anything in North America has to be an Indian. So they might have been misidentified. The Spiral Mounds. These were dug up in 1934 by the Dakota Mining Company. I'm not calling this an expedition. This was looting, plain and simple. They did not care about the Indian artifacts. They did not care about remains. They were after gold. In fact, there are accounts of them pulling out the remains of Native Americans out of these burial mounds and throwing them in a ditch. This is a screenshot or a picture of the 1934 dig Spiro. And these are some of the artifacts they pulled out of the mounds. That's quite clearly a Native American being represented in this pipe. That's quite clearly an eagle. Now, when you start seeing stuff like this, that stops and makes you wonder. Because the nose is flat, kind of hard to make out that these are depicted as picking up rocks and having hair all over their bodies. So it kind of makes you wonder if they weren't thinking about something else when they made these. That these might not be people that are being depicted. And they turned up some giant skeletons associated with the Spiro mounds. Now I just said that a lot of these tribes that were in the area were actively looking for the bones. And in 1934, they found a giant femur. In 1936, they supposedly found an 8-foot mummy in there. And then 3 other giant skeletons were supposed to have been found. They were buried with ceremonial artifacts, but that doesn't mean that whatever was buried there had made those artifacts. What I honestly think might have happened is those things were there, and maybe the mound builders that built these mounds put the artifacts in there as kind of a tribute. So, where did they go? I just said, bodies they weren't interested in, they tossed them out back in the ditch. These guys were not archaeologists, they were not scientists, they were after gold. So, yeah, there might have been some giant skeletons there. There might have been their actual remains of Bigfoot that were being held in venerance by the mound builders. But since these guys didn't care, they got chunked out and probably turned into nothing, dust. However, not all skeletons have that distinction. Some of them actually do get saved. The Washita River skeletons were unearthed near Pauls Valley in 1937 after a flash flood. 6 skeletons were found. Every one of them was over 7 foot when fully articulate. Now, a lot of people will lay a skeleton out on the ground and it'll be 7, 8 foot, but they don't realize when you add the connective tissue, it's a lot shorter. It's like 6 foot. No, this 7 foot was reached by scientific determination that these things were 7, 8 feet tall when they had their connective tissue. In fact, several of them were still growing when they died. And unlike the stuff from Spiro, these were examined by anthropologists, specifically Dr. Forrest Clements. He was the head of anthropology at OU in this time frame. And I read his write-up on this, his academic paper. He kept using words like Neanderthaloid, strange Indians, ape-like build. But he wouldn't call it anything else. He said they had to be Indians. So yeah, OU may have some dead Bigfoot actually sitting in their cooler, or in the bottom of their museum in a drawer somewhere, that nobody has probably looked at for 60 plus years. And this is them digging up the bones right there. This was found in a deposit that was left by a flash flood, and ironically enough, uncovered by another flash flood. This is a newspaper write-up that's pretty easily found talking about it. And, Norman, Oklahoma, 6 giant skeletons of a tribe of strange Indians, all over 7 foot tall, were recovered along the banks of the Washita River east of Pauls Valley. And it goes on down and talks about this has led the discoverer to suspect that maybe a race of giant unknown Indians had lived there. And it wasn't fully over, because that same flash flood unearthed another one down at Whitehead, just downriver. And this one was actually found in a native settlement that had also been wiped out by the same flash flood. So it's almost like it got deposited there by the flood. And this was found by WMA workers. And like I said, the stuff that they were pulling out of the native village was not giant spears or stuff like that. It was normal. You know, mixing bowls, scrapers. So they find all this normal Indian stuff, and all of a sudden they find a giant skeleton. And it was shipped to OU with the other ones. And there's a few other ones. There was supposed to be a giant skeleton found in Guthrie in 1919. And that one was also supposedly shipped to the university. There was supposed to be one dug up in Jacktown that pretty much all that disappeared. Now, the grandson of the landowner said that he found a couple of the bones and kept them. And I've been talking with him, and he's been trying to figure out where they are. I don't know if there's any credence to this story. Supposedly, in 1948, another giant skeleton popped up in the Wichita Mountains. And then in El Reno, they found a monster skull near Concho. And when I say skull, it was a partial skull. They said it was a jawbone, but they said it looked like a human jawbone with pointed canine teeth. And they said that it was huge. Now, I want to talk about some of the more interesting finds I have found in these newspaper articles. I talked last year about the Chickasha critter. I'm not getting too in-depth on this. This was the most impressive sighting outbreak I've ever stumbled across. It was a single 10-year-long sighting outbreak with dozens and dozens of sightings. And it lasted from 1910 to 1920. This is kind of what Chickasha looked like at the time when these things were being seen right on the edge of town. Now, I mentioned a white creature being seen by some Comancheros earlier. This has led to what I call Old Whitey. Old Whitey appears to be a white-haired creature that was in a single area that kept getting seen. I have found multiple stories from 1868 to about 1919, which is well within the average lifespan of a primate, in the Red River bottoms, of people seeing a white-haired ghost or a white-haired monster or something along these lines. They all give it its own little name, but when you plot them on a map, they're awfully close together. What I think we were seeing was multiple accounts of the same creature at various times in its life being seen in that area. So here's the Old Whitey. And this is another neat one that I found. Now, who all knows when the term Bigfoot was first coined? Anybody?
50, right? The fire timber crew, I guess it was? Or?
Yeah, 1958. At least that's what I thought. Until I read this article from the Daily Oklahoman in 1935 from Wewoka, Oklahoma, talking about the Bigfoot monster. How it's probably an escaped gorilla, and this thing had been raiding farms. Over 20 years prior to Bluff Creek, Bigfoot here in Oklahoma. So this one actually has the potential to make it quite a few Bigfooters on the West Coast a little angry. And I'm going to give you, just to close this off, I'm going to give a little sample of different sightings from around Oklahoma that I've read about. Just brief summaries, let you guys know kind of what happened. Because I know I've said some stories about violence and all that. Well, we know that doesn't always happen, but they're stories. That, I don't know why it got put on that. Okay. This was a pre-1950 sighting map to just kind of give you an idea of the range of them. And you can see they were all over the state. And each one of those colors is a different decade. And I got them going back to the 1800s. Okay. The 1890s, there was a sighting by a man. He reported this in the Oklahoma Indian Pioneer papers of the Poto River wild man. And real simple story. The guy was going. Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. Do you guys want me to talk about this, or do you just want me to quickly zip through it?
Talk about it.
Anyway, this guy was going out fishing as a young man, saw a red-haired wild man looking at him and turned and ran away. The Chaska wild man, there was a manhunt to look for the one that pulled the guy off the horse. And to make a long story short, they didn't catch it, but they did manage to kill a goat at night that they mistook for a wild man. The Coal Creek wild man, and this was another one, there was a manhunt for it. Then in 1901, you had the White Oak Bear Man. Again, another posse went out to look for one of these things. 1901, you had the Osage Wild Man, which is one of the more fascinating ones because it refers to two things. There was a serial killer in the late 1800s in that region. They caught him and killed him, and they declared the wild man was gone, but they kept seeing the wild man. So, then just down the road here, Darren, how do you pronounce that again? I apologize. Yeah. I'm not used to the Cherokee words, you know that. I'm more used to Choctaw and Chickasaw. I'm the other side of the state. But there was a newspaper write-up about a hobgoblin living in the woods, and they said it must have been a ghost. It was hairy, it screamed, liked to throw rocks, scare people. Then, Big Cabin, Oklahoma, there was a sighting of a ghost, which proceeded to kill and carry off a goat. Then there was the Bartlesville wild man. Two women were sitting on a porch, and they said their property was right next to the river, and they said they seen this big black thing come out of the river, look at it, and turn and walk off. And several other people saw it. Miami, Oklahoma, they had a gorilla hunt, and the paper wrote it off that the people were too stupid to tell the difference between a gorilla and a pig. 1830s, there was sightings of the Pumpkin Hollow White Thing, which was supposed to be a white, hairy creature running around Pumpkin Hollow. You go to southeast Oklahoma. I mentioned the Mud Creek. Well, I mentioned this account earlier. I didn't know why I put it on here twice. But the one about the old woman shooting the one in the butt with a load of rock salt, that was from Mud Creek. Then you had the Idabel Critter. This one was going around raiding traps. The 1900s, you had the Winding Stair Mountain Monster, and there was supposedly a family that shot one, and seeing what it was, got scared out of their mind and moved to Mena. Then you had the Kingston Wild Man of the Mountains, which they believed was a fur trapper that got demented and somehow grew a few extra feet. Then you had the Wampanoag Wild Woman. And then that one, these guys were moving through this area at night, and they said they seen this 7-foot-tall hairy woman come out of the woods screaming at them. Then in the 1920s, you had the Idabel Swamp Monster. Some guys said they seen a 13-foot-tall hairy monster roaming around the swamps in Idabel. Oklahoma City, 1901. They had reports of what they called his bear ship. The stories go that they were seeing a bear on the edge of Oklahoma City, but this bear was weird. It walked on two legs, and it was 10 feet tall. But it's clearly a bear. Then you had the Greer County Wild Man, which I love. This is way out in southwest Oklahoma. Story goes this thing had been killing and eating calves, and it shows up at this ranch house one night, and the mother and son look out and they see this thing. And the weirdest thing of all, they said it's got an old rusty pistol. And they said it's just sitting there waving it around, and it goes off and drops it. And they said it turns and walks off. So that doesn't really sound like a person doing that to me. And Turner Falls, Well, okay, Guthrie, supposedly they were trying to capture what they thought was a young black girl that had hit her head and went feral and somehow got covered with fur that was seen on the edge of town. And then there was the Turner Falls White Ghost, where a group of soldiers that had taken a job as a mine after they got out of the military heard this story about this place being haunted. When I talked about the cabin with the Lopa attack, it's the same area. And they said that they were out there and they see this white thing walking through the woods. And they assume it's a ghost. But this ghost left footprints and they were able to track it for a while. Then 1912, the Enid Wild Man. Some folks at by Enid were supposedly chased and attacked by a wild man, and it managed to kill one of their horses. Then they fired a shotgun at it, and it took off the opposite direction for a pretty good reason. 1915, there was the Fallen Monster. There was a group of Navajo Indians actually living out there that reported seeing skinwalkers. And they said that the skinwalkers were 8 feet tall, hairy, liked to hit trees, and they took off. Then there was a grip of terror that happened in 1919 in Fairview, Oklahoma, about what they called the Fairview Phantom. They would see this thing going around town at night raiding trash, and they said it was 7 foot tall, solid black. The story goes it was supposed to be the ghost of a bride, and she'd been dead and killed, and her sadness turned her white dress black, and that's why you could never see anything, and it was in shreds, almost like a ghillie suit or hair. So again, the Fairview Phantom wasn't a ghost. In 1922, there was a report in Carter, Oklahoma, about a guy seeing a bunch of bears walking in a row down the Washita River. And he said he could tell that they were bears because when they walked upright, he could see the females had mammary tissue. He could see the breasts on the females. Now, how many of you are very familiar with bear anatomy? I can tell you where the actual mammary tissue on a bear is located. You're not going to see it up on the chest like it says in this account. No, it's down kind of like dogs. It's down low. So, these bears don't travel in groups, so they weren't really bears. So, in conclusion, I had to kind of zip through there. There's actually a long history of sightings in Oklahoma prior to 1958, so anybody that says there's no history of Bigfoot in Oklahoma doesn't know what they're talking about. And hopefully coming this year, you'll be able to read about this stuff and a lot more in my book. The Oklahoma Wild Man, a look at the Sooner State's long history with Bigfoot. Got to plug the advertisement.
Absolutely.
Thank you.